We continue our look at the metropolis by examining urban planning and some key agents of change. Urban planning came about as our cities grew rapidly. The growth of our cities led to what are known as urban pathologies, things like congestion, pollution, incompatible property uses. So what we saw was planning looked to control what happened where in a city, address certain problems that were arising, and as we'll also see, became a tool of the affluent as a way to separate land use, separate incompatible uses. Now, incompatible uses could be heavy industry in residential areas, but it could also be low income groups. It could also be certain practices that are deemed undesirable for a certain community. When we look at urban planning, we recognize in the United States that it's mostly local. Most of our urban planning initiatives and councils are held at a local level. Now, we often have state and federal guidelines that help create frameworks, but most of it is local. And when we look around the world, we see a mix of local and national. National policies are very profound in places like China, where entire cities of 1 million or more people are planned and built within a decade. But here in the US, we'll recognize that a lot of our planning is in fact local. Two different types of planning that we'll examine. The first is visionary, and this is radical change, both social and economic. This is really redesigning a space or designing a space from scratch. And some of the agents of change that we're going to look at, that we're going to highlight, would fall into this visionary planning approach. The other is institutionalized, and this exists within existing structures. Now, this is really how most of our planning is done. It's done within an existing framework, within an existing community, not radical changes, not totally redeveloping space and introducing a whole new sense of place. Our biggest planning tool is in fact zoning, and zoning limits land use. In 1916, we saw our first zoning come through in New York City covenants. Now, covenants are legal agreements on how a property can be used. What we find is that the New York City covenants arose from the growth of the garment industry. Now, the garment industry created some of those pathologies like congestion, taller buildings which blocked sunlight, created a less inviting and in some cases less healthy environment. It also was used as a tool to limit the expanse of the Jewish community. And we'll see in upcoming chapters how these different covenants affect different groups in their ability to pursue social and geographic mobility. The map on your screen right here looks at Towson's zoning map. Now, this zoning map has been a point of controversy over the last decade or so, as Towson has undergone a number of redevelopment plans. For those of you who have been at Towson for a few years, or those of you who are new to the scene, Towson is changing, and we're recognizing some areas of competition. We're recognizing some areas that include visionary planning, so totally redesigning parts of Towson, while other parts of the area, particularly on the fringe of Towson's core, would fall more into the institutionalized way of planning. But again, a map like this highlights what type of land use can be practiced where. We're going to look at our first agent of change, and our first agent of change is a man by the name of Pierre L'Enfant. And L'Enfant was a French military planner, and he was granted the rights to create the plan for DC. Now, the United States Constitution laid forward that the Congress could fund and design a city. So the problem for this planner was evident. The United States needed a federal city. The solution was a visionary plan, became known as the L'Enfant Plan. L'Enfant used a series of grids and diagonals to create the plan for Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. Now, for those of you who ever have to drive in D.C., you recognize that this really is an 18th century plan and not something designed for 21st century transportation. But the plan itself was a grand plan, wanted to put forth a nation's capital, something for the country to be proud of, something that would include the president's house. L'Enfant used the concept of a grand avenue, something that was later used in Baron Haussmann's redevelopment of Paris. L'Enfant's Grand Avenue became the National Mall over time, a place of parades, a place of celebration, gathering, a place of recognition for the city. But when we look again, when we step back and we say, who is this agent of change? L'Enfant helped pave the way forward, create specific opportunities for how Washington, D.C. would evolve. A person like L'Enfant separates the trajectory of Washington, D.C. from the concentric zone model, which looked at just the competition for space. The land in which Washington, D.C. currently sits was really a backwater. The port of Alexandria was a growing port, but not on par with Baltimore or New York or Boston in the late 1700s. So the land was available, and it took a vision and it took a plan to create the foundation for Washington, D.C. If this had just grown organically, Washington looked much different than it does today. L'Enfant's Grand Avenue plan influenced the Macmillan Plan, which was introduced in 1901 and created the National Mall. Again, the centerpiece of Washington, D.C. Now, in a purely capitalist competition-based land model, the mall would include skyscrapers, would recognize that market-driven competition for space. But because of L'Enfant's plan, this space is very different today. This visionary approach created a radically different social and economic establishment. In 1835, the plan was disrupted by what is known as retrocession, as parts of Maryland and Virginia were annexed to create the federal capital, as outlined in the diamond on the right-hand side of your screen. The retrocession occurred when Virginia felt like economically this federal city wasn't benefiting them to the extent that it should. So Virginia reclaimed a good chunk of the land that was granted for the federal city, and Alexandria became again a port of Virginia. Our second agent of change is a man by the name of Frederick Law Olmsted. In 1857, Olmsted and a partner put together what was known as the Greenwich Plan. The Greenwich Plan looked to address a couple problems. New York City was growing rapidly. Between 1820 and 1855, the population of New York quadrupled. This was a time of growing commerce in a time of early industrialization. And New York was really took these forces and ran with it. As a result of this rapid population growth, this congregation of people, this seemingly chaotic scene in lower Manhattan, the recognition of social conditions and concerning poor social conditions became a driving force. So the city established a group to accept plans on how to grow or how to move New York forward. The image on your right looks at a picture of some of the tenements, some of the housing, some of the lives that were playing out in Manhattan. This was viewed poorly by those in control, by those who wanted to see New York as a prosperous, affluent place. So the Greenwich Plan tried to create a solution. The Central Park Board was formed, and the recognition that quality of life and economic success were hand in hand. What existed in the middle of the island of Manhattan was a dairy farm. And the image on the top right looks at some of the sheep that were the original inhabitants of this part of the island. So the Greenwich Plan said that we're going to set aside this space in the middle of Manhattan for outdoor recreation. And here's a map of the Greenwich Plan. So as the island began to experience rapid development, the Central Park Board wanted to be sure that areas were set aside where people could connect with nature, could experience the restorative, positive attributes of park and open space. In order for this park to be established, the city had to clear out its original inhabitants. Again, many of these inhabitants were free blacks, Irish immigrants, farmers. There were churches and cemeteries in this place. So one of the concerning aspects of planning, again, resurfaces here with this plan, and that while Central Park today is potentially the most valuable real estate on earth, we see that in order to establish it, in order to create the change, the vision for this space, the original inhabitants were displaced, the area was opened up, and today, again, we recognize both the benefits and some of the concerns with this type of planning approach. Here's a view looking onto Central Park, and again, you can see the competition for space that exists around the park. The competition for space that without a visionary, without an agent of change like Olmsted, the park would just be a continuation of this high density development. Olmsted also influenced a major park closer to Towson University, known as Druid Hill Park. Druid Hill Park was a piece of land that was purchased from a prominent magistrate in the mid-1800s, and the former Buchanan estate was set aside and organized as a public park. And as you can see here, it's the third oldest public park in the United States. Our next agent of change shared similar ideas to those of L'Enfant. Baron Haussmann created the plan for Paris, and Haussmann did his work about a half century after L'Enfant. And Haussmann was tasked with a pretty significant problem. The image on your right shows the medieval Paris, and Paris into the mid-1800s was still sitting atop a medieval city. Paris's population, like that of New York City, quadrupled in just a couple decades. Medieval cities were not known for efficient transportation, were not known for open space. Medieval cities, like this image we see on the right, reflected competition for space, chaotic competition for space, where individuals were clustered on top of each other. So as Paris's population exploded, there were cholera outbreaks, there was congestion, there were reports of crime, there were issues with poverty. There were a lot of social concerns. A lot of these urban pathologies began to emerge. So Haussmann was tasked with creating a better way forward. And now an institutionalized approach, a pragmatic approach existing within the existing framework and structures wasn't seen as a viable out. So Haussmann's solution was different. He wanted to completely redesign an existing space, where L'Enfant was able to really use a blank canvas. Haussmann had to figure out a way to recreate a major international city, even in the mid-1800s. He wanted his redesigned, reimagined city to reflect opulence. So he wasn't just looking for efficiency, he was looking to make an international statement. He wanted to incorporate railroads, the modern form of transportation, aqueducts to efficiently move sanitary water in and out of the city, and gardens to build on those ideas that Olmsted also incorporated into New York. Haussmann's results? Well, we recognize that Paris today is much different than those images on the right. His results are an opulent modern city. Paris is an international destination. The term Haussmannization became very closely tied with this type of visionary approach. Haussmannization means that the creative destruction for the betterment of society exists in your plans. So Paris was demolished, and the idea being that the outcome was the betterment of the society, even though we completely wiped out communities and most of the city and displaced a lot of vulnerable people and communities. So it is a very